Welcome to Quilting Stash with scraps of information and ideas for your quilting pleasure. This is episode number 237. When is a quilt more than just a quilt? And I'm Annie Smith, bringing you Quilting Stash, the first podcast for quilters and longest running podcast for quilters. Hi, quilters. Well, it has been a minute since I've done a podcast, and I want you to know that I am always thinking about what I can talk about for a podcast. And this one is actually a combination of a video cast and a podcast. So if you're listening to this as a podcast and you have time to watch the video, well, go over to my website, anniesmith.net, and you'll find the link for the video. And if you found this as a video and you just want to listen to it as a podcast, you can go over to iTunes or into the podcast area of my website as well and pull it up as just a podcast. But anyway, I wanted to give you a visual as well as just an audio because this one is kind of special and important. And so, it's been a minute. But it's something that I really enjoy doing. And so anyway, let's go ahead and proceed. This one is a little odd. I've never done a vidcast before, but so, and I'm used to doing online classes, so it's just kind of like falling off a log. But so hopefully there won't be too many stops and starts and so, that kind of thing. Anyway, so the topic of this show is, when is a quilt not just a quilt? And I want to talk to you about this because I have an idea about something that is like when I did my podcast in 2005, was a little bit ahead of its time and nobody knew what to do with me. And now the podcasts are, commonplace every day. And there's a wealth of them. They're the hip happening thing. So I hope that this topic will get you to think about something that you're going to want to do. So the background to this is I've actually been doing this lecture for several years. And like I said, it's ahead of its time. And it was originally called The Legacy of Our Quilts. And that didn't work. And so now it's called If Our Quilts Could Talk, What Would They Say About Us? That implies secrets, doesn't it? It really does. And so that's what this is all about. And in fact, I'm going to be teaching this as a half-day class at Road to California's Road at Home, which is the virtual classes that are taking place instead of the in-person live classes that they usually have at Road to California, which means that everybody from around the world has an opportunity to take an online class from an international instructor online. So anyway, I just want to give you some background to the class and give you a little bit of food for thought about this because it's part lecture, part class, because I have all the tools to give you to help you see where you need to go with whatever of your quilts that you want to talk about. Okay, so in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a huge push within the quilting industry encouraging students to put labels on the backs of their quilts so that the quilt can be identified in the future. And so the name of the quilt, our names, the time frame in which the quilt was made, where it was made, what it was made out of, who the quilter was, if it wasn't quilted by the person who originally made the quilt, if it was actually a pattern designed by someone else, what the name of the pattern was. And so all of these reference points were suggested to put into a quilt label because in the mid 80s, quilts were really being acquired for collections, and museums were acquiring quilts. And the saddest part about it is that the quilts that were made like in late 1800s, and the quilts that were coming around then, nobody knew who the maker was. And it was just a woman who recycled fabric from her family's worn out clothes to make a quilt because it was utilitarian. They needed to make their own blankets. And, they never thought in a million years that their workmanship would be fine enough to actually be put into a collection at a museum and valued for $20,000 or something like that. And so they just never thought about putting a label on. Besides, there was some kind of vainness about putting your name on a quilt as if you were some, great celebrity person, and which none of those women were, right, who were making quilts during that time. And so they just thought, oh, this is just not important, so why put a label on it? And so much of that history of the quilters has been lost. So one thing that you don't see me or hear me do when I do a podcast is take a drink. So now, over the last several years, and when Quilter's newsletter was still in print, there were all of these little stories that would come in the magazines on a regular basis. Women who talked about the background of their quilts and what they were feeling and what they were thinking and what they were working out. Perhaps they were going through cancer. Perhaps they were caring for an aged parent, or going through a particular trial in their life that was a part of the weave of the quilt, because as we work on quilts, we work things out, right? It's just like working in a garden or doing any task that helps you to do what you're doing without overly focusing on it, but giving you the time to spend alone with yourself and your feelings and your thoughts, to be able to work out what it is that you've got going on. So I kept seeing these little stories over and over again, which made me create this lecture that I did called The Legacy of Our Quilts, and talking about the history that is locked inside our quilts that only we know, because those, we don't necessarily keep a journal and write down everything that's going on when we're working on a quilt. But all we really need to do is look at a quilt and look at the fabrics and the memories of the time frame and all of the larger picture. So what was going on in the world, what was going on in the place where we lived, what was going on in our homes, in our families, but specifically in our hearts and in our thoughts, that only we know, because that's a part of the working out of everything that's going on with us while we're busy with our hands working on a quilt. So I want to talk. Oh, one before I share a quilt, I want to share this with you. Okay, the other thing that really made me think about writing down the history of my quilts is in 2005, on a day that I was recording a podcast, my mom passed away. And I was recording the podcast, and someone stuck a note underneath my nose and said, "You need to get to the hospital right away." And I was mid-sentence, and I still had about 15 more minutes of the podcast that I needed to record. And so I finished it, and I pressed the stop button, and I hopped in the car, and I went over to the hospital, and we had a couple of hours with my mom before she passed. But then, in going through her things, I am the family historian as far as the pictures and letters and correspondences and things like that for my family. And I am the keeper of my parents' yearbooks. Look how thin that is. Mine's about that thick. But this is from high school in Campbell, California, that both of my parents went to. And my dad was a sophomore in 1943, and my mom was a freshman. And the cutest thing about this book is all these little inscriptions that are part of the book that tell another story about our parents as teenagers, which we never figured that they were teenagers when we were teenagers, right? And I sat down with these a couple months after my mom passed away, and I read through both books, both his and hers. And so they dated in high school, and then they broke up, and then my mom's senior year they got back together again. And the coolest thing about this particular book are things about my dad that I never ever knew about. And for instance, one of the inscriptions says, "For a little man, you fly pretty high, considering. When are you going to hit 15 feet?" And so my dad was played basketball, and he was the basketball star. My dad was 5'9", but he was the basketball star and helped to win a lot of the games for Campbell High School. But he was also in track, and apparently he pole vaulted. And that was something that I never knew. And I just thought, oh, I want to ask my mom about that. And I couldn't ask my mom about that because, I just waited too long to pull these books out when she was still alive and go through all of this stuff. But the one thing that I think is just really sweet is this little inscription right here, which says, "Dear Floyd, you're the kind of a boy that any mother would like for her daughter to associate with, Joyce's mother." And so when my parents were going together, my granny saw it in my dad's yearbook. I just think that is the sweetest thing in the world. But the heartbreaking thing about this is that when my parents were still alive, I had the opportunity to find out more about them and what made them really real people. And I didn't do that. My dad died when he was 48 years old, and I was 20. And so my mom was a widow for, a very long time. And of course, she died suddenly. So, we didn't have the opportunity to spend all that really important time with her. But word to the wise people, if your parents are still alive, ask them questions. So anyway, so um, so that in conjunction with the articles that were in Quilter's newsletter are the reason why I feel so passionate about this topic and want to just encourage you to understand how important it is for you to be able to write your personal histories taken out of the quilts that you've made, because they have your secrets and things that you haven't necessarily shared with your family, but that your family is going to want to know about you. And maybe some things are just really too personal to write about. You can leave those things out, but write about the important things that tell your family who you are. Okay, so I want to talk to you about this quilt that is behind me. It is called Tangerine Galaxy, and it's one of my patterns that I have done. It's called Tangerine and Interchange. And so this is the Tangerine Galaxy quilt, and it's a simple 8-pointed star with an interest block that takes the design of the 8-pointed star out of the surrounding the block and pulling it inside so that you have uh, additional points of view to look at. And then the thing about this is called a stash busters pattern. And what I do with this and why I do is because I will make the original pattern, and then with the leftovers, I will create a second quilt in an effort to bust my stash instead of putting the leftover fabrics back into my stash and then makes me feel guilty about buying more fabric, which I don't do guilty. So I had this idea for one set of quilts and it worked out just beautifully. And so I've done it over and over again. And Stash Busters is actually one of the workshops that I teach. And so we make the primary quilt and then they get to design a secondary quilt from it. And so I was teaching this class. It's a 2-day class. So you make the tangerine quilt on the first day and the interchange quilt on the second day with the leftovers. And so there, let's see, I had moved from Fort Worth in October. And so the following June, I was teaching back in California where I lived at one of my favorite quilt shops. It's called Modern Handmade Supply, and it's in Scotts Valley, California, in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so when I arrived, I decided, because I was taking everything in suitcases, that I'd just get the fabric for the sample quilt that I was going to demonstrate once I arrived, and then I do all the cutting and whatever demo work I needed to do for the students. So I chose this art gallery fabric, which is just one of the most gorgeous fabrics I have ever seen. I love, love, love all of the colors and the pattern, and it just spoke to me so much. And so one of the things I do is I like to keep the selvage edge information on the fabric so that I know what the reference is if I have to get more. And because actually, while I was making this, I had to get more. So this is from the Lugu collection, and Jessica Swift is the designer. And again, it's art gallery. And let me show you the little palette of colors. There you go. There are the little color bubbles. That is what my color palette is. And so along with this fabric, I chose these supporting fabrics, which are just absolutely perfect. Let me open this up and see if I can hold this up all together and show you really well. Well, okay, let's do this. And then here we go. So you can see just how beautiful they are. And I wanted it to be on a white background because I wanted it to be very modern and do some cool quilting in it. But I just loved the teal and orange and kind of almost a chartreuse yellow and then magenta that is part of this line, and from the fabrics that I chose that just go together so well. And so here's the deal. When I teach, I get, I am demoing just so that my students can get the technique. And so I demonstrate as far as I can go. And then at some point they surpass me, which is fine. That's exactly what I want them to do. And because I've got the sample with me. So I had, this original sample with me to show them what the quilt looked like. And so I chose, okay, so this fabric is my main fabric, and you can see this right here. And so the large 8-inch square is my focus fabric, where I pulled all of my color palette from. And then I wanted the secondary fabric to be this lovely little modern orange geometric print. And so that was meant to go here. So they're they're offset in the next row with the focus fabric. And that's what draws your eye and creates the additional 8-inch square so that they overlap each other. And so I was really pretty happy with that. And we used design walls in the classroom. And everybody designed all of their pieces. And then we had all these leftover half square triangles to make the additional quilt. And so, again, on day number 2, they had gotten everything designed and went past me. And at the end of the class, I folded all my fabrics up and put them in my suitcase to take home or to my next stop. I was going to teach in Colorado before I went home. And so the cool thing is that I have all of the memories of this trip. I was actually in California and Colorado for 2 weeks. And I got to spend a week at my sister's house. And it was such a luxury thing to be able to do because we have always, since we've been adults, we've always been so busy with our families and work and this and that and everything else. But we got quite close when our mom died, and we were there to support each other through all of the very physical stuff that we ended up having to do for the sale of her house. And so it was wonderful to spend time with my sister. We went to high school together, and so we have a lot of similar friends, that we were catching up talking about. But I just loved being able to spend time with her and just her and me and talk about the things that are important. And we also share quilting. So we went to some quilt shops together and spent some real quality time. And then from there, like I said, I went and I taught in Colorado, and I met up with one of my dearest friends from high school. Everybody thought that we were cousins, and so we always called each other cousin, and always felt like we were related somewhere. And so we had a wonderful time catching up with each other. And so those memories and those conversations are also a part of this quilt that I began in California. And so I can sit down and I can add pictures from my trip into a book. I can write, the places that we went together and the fun things that we did and talked about and experienced, because those things are all in this quilt, all of the memories of that. And every time I look at these fabrics, I think about being in California and being with my sister Judy and my friend Eileen and just the wonderful period of time that was. And so, when I got home, I was home for a couple of weeks, and then I had to repack my bags and go on to a new destination. And this quilt became a UFO. It was, when life intervenes, you just put it in a box with a label and the pattern and everything, so that when you have time again to pick it up, you can pick it up and know exactly where you left off and what you need to do. Put it back up on the design wall and see the pattern starting to emerge from it. And so uh, that was from 2018. Okay. And then 2019 went by and I was busy traveling and all that. And then 2020 hit. And the first 2 months of the year, I was busy traveling. I was traveling and teaching and not even thinking about this quilt or anything having to do with it. And then COVID hit and the country shut down. And I was actually on a teaching trip in North Carolina when the country closed down and had to figure out how to get home. And so when I got home, all of a sudden, oh my goodness, I had time on my hands to do things that I have never had time to be able to do before. And also, though, I was contracted to teach in several different locations that ended up being Zoom meetings, and I was teaching online. And so at the end of May, beginning of June, I did an online class and lecture for the Cumberland Valley Quilt Association in Franklin, Tennessee. And so the Stash Busters class is the one that they chose as their workshop. And the cool part about the Stash Busters class is they had 4 different quilts to choose from. So there's this one called Courthouse Cabin, which is a courthouse steps log cabin with cornerstones in it. And then this is a standalone quilt, but you can also make a variable 9-patch and a Chinese coins quilt with leftover strips from this pattern. And then the other one that they decided to do was the Tangerine Galaxy quilt and the Interchange secondary quilt. And so in the class, half of them did courthouse steps and half of them did tangerine quilt. And the techniques are totally different from each other. The courthouse steps is a series of graduated strips, and then the tangerine quilt is based on half square triangles. And so the courthouse steps quilt has a bunch of strips that you can use for strip piecing. And then the tangerine has a bunch of half square triangle quilt pieces that you can use to create a secondary quilt. So with the Guild, we had a fabulous time. The class was 6 hours long, and we kept our Zoom up the entire time. And so everybody could visit, talk to each other, catch up with each other from the Guild. And it was just absolutely perfect. It just couldn't have been better. And at the end, so I resurrected this quilt to demonstrate for them what to do with the half square triangles and show them how to put the quilt together on the design wall, which was a perfect demo piece for them because I had part of the quilt already done. I had the sample quilt that was already done, but then I had at least half of the quilt was not done so that I could show them the components and how everything went together. And then also show them how to use their half square triangles to create the additional quilt, which I'll show you in a minute. But so at the end of that day, I realized that that square, that orange geometric, was just not going to work. Because if you're looking at the video, you can see that it just kind of fades to the background and goes blah. And there's no definition with it at all. It does not allow the focus fabric to shine whatsoever. And so I just thought, what am I going to do? And so I had to pick apart the first couple rows that I had done. And also I wanted to find another fabric that would work. And the only one that I found that was actually available online, which was the only way we could get fabric at this point, was to choose the other piece of this Lugu collection, which is this lovely owl print that has a black background, or actually it's dark green, it's not black. But it's just fabulous. And these fabrics were meant to go together and play together. And, you know, that owl is the perfect foil of darkness to the light colored focus fabric that I have that has a white background. And of course, it has all the supporting fabric colors too. And so it was just perfect. And I think you can see, you know, the sample quilt behind me. It's just beautiful. And it ended up just being very cool. So I worked on this quilt because I was supposed to go and teach in North Carolina in July. And this was the class that the store opted to use. So I had to hurry up and get this sample done and also get the second quilt done. So once I got done with this one, I had all of the half square triangles left over. And so let me show you the quilt that I made. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and pin it up on top of the this quilt. And of course I didn't bring pins, right? I'm so glad that I'm in my studio because now I have access to everything. So I really, really wanted my focus fabric to be the hero of this quilt. And so I used it. Let's see if I can do this without it falling down. I used it in the cornerstones of each of the sashing areas, and then used the colored secondary fabric for the little hole in the barn door squares that make this quilt go together. And so you can see it looks very different from the original tangerine quilt. The interchange quilt is just really fun. And so, it's just very simple. But the great part about having two quilts made out of the same fabrics is that number one, they don't look the same, but they're using the same fabrics and the same colors that are in the fabrics. So if you want to decorate a room, they both go beautifully in the same room together without fighting each other. So you could use one as a wall quilt as art, and then one, draped on a sofa or on a bed or whatever. And it just makes a beautiful decorator point in a room. So you can see both quilts behind me. And it's just kind of a cool way to use your stash. Okay, so that's the second one. So I'm going to take this down again because the major part of the story that I have to share with you going on is in this quilt. So let's see. So after or the day of the second day of the workshop for Cumberland Valley, when they were working on the second quilt, or actually, sorry, this is the part that gets a little hazy for me. June 3rd was the day that we had the workshop and they were working on this quilt. When I got off of the Zoom call, I got a text from my sister saying that her son, who lives right by Franklin, Tennessee, was working on a job, and he's an electrician, and that he had been electrocuted. And she didn't know anything more than that. And immediately our family rallied together and started sending our thoughts and prayers to my nephew. And so it the weird part of it was for me that I was working with quilters from the same area where my oldest nephew lives. And in their area, there were all kinds of conflicting reports coming out. He was working on dismantling a nuclear power plant, and the area where they were working was supposed to be cold, which means no electricity going to it at all. And the cabinet that he stepped into was still hot and live. And it is an absolute miracle in every way that my nephew is still alive and that he recovered from that. Um, so for about 72 hours, we didn't know exactly what was going to happen for him, whether he was going to be well or whether he was going to need to have surgery or any of those things. But um, for some strange reason, his life was spared. And we're all really thankful for that. But the story of what happened to him is also a part of this quilt, especially because I was teaching it the day that I found out about his accident. And so that is a part of it, which I do have to write about, by the way, and because I have started to take pictures of all of my fabric selection and the pictures that I take while a quilt is in progress to see if it's working out the way I want it to. And then put that together for a book. And I've actually, with this particular one, I'm going to make a Snapchat book with the pictures in the book and then all of the text and story of what this quilt is all about along with that book. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes so I could, because I don't want to forget anything. And so anyway, I was trying to hurry up and finish this and then finish the second quilt to get it sent off to a quilt shop. And so I did that and sent the quilt tops to the store where I was going to be teaching. And then all of a sudden the class got canceled and they had to send my things back to me, which is, fine. But at that point I could get this quilt quilted. And so then, so it's been quilted and it's been waiting for the binding and for about 6 weeks, I guess. And in the meantime, we found out that Chris, my nephew, who I was just talking about, his wife has been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. And so, that's another part of the story of this quilt, because it's what's happening in the world, in your community, in your home, with your family, what's going on in your heart. And so then I found out that my husband's nephew, who was the best man at our wedding, his wife now has breast cancer and is going through chemo treatments. And so I was just like, oh my gosh, I've got to get some quilts done so I can mail them to our nieces. And so I picked this one to send to Jennifer, my husband's nephew's wife. And because Moira hasn't started her chemo treatments yet, and Jen has. And so I just thought, I just got to put everything aside and I've got to get the binding on this quilt. So I decided to use this orange stripe as the binding on the quilt. And so it's very secondary to the quilt and it just kind of frames it, which is exactly what I wanted. But I always machine stitch the binding to the quilt and then I fold it over and stitch by hand, which takes anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. And so, 4 days before Christmas, I was sitting there putting everything else aside and I was just working because I had to get that in the mail for Jennifer because I wanted her to have it in time for her next chemo treatment. So I got the quilt done. I wrapped it up, headed to the post office. And on the way to the post office, I had this thought, Annie, you can't send her that quilt. I just thought, wow, where did that come from? And so I pulled over and I just thought, why can't I send her this quilt? Because I pulled over because it was disturbing to me. And so I grabbed my phone and I looked up symbolism of owls because it was the only um, overly symbolic thing that was in the quilt, right? Because, well, my focus fabric, that's just, a beautiful design, right? And it turns out that the owl is the symbolic um, carrier of people into eternity when they pass away. And I just went, oh my gosh, I cannot send that quilt to Jennifer. So I turned around and I came back and I chose another really beautiful quilt that I just love, that I knew would be the right thing to send her. And so this quilt almost became a take to chemo quilt. And I'm really glad that I held it back because it allows me now to share with you just all of the symbolism and my personal history that is in this quilt. And so it would have been fine for me to send it to Jennifer as well, but I just could not send anything that was portentous of um, anything that would not be totally positive, right? So anyway, that's the other story behind this quilt. So um, let's see. So it was finished on December 22nd, and it was started in mid-June of 2018. So it took 2 years and some change in order to get it done. But quilters, this is my COVID quilt. The lion's share of the history in this quilt is all about what has gone on when I picked it up again to put it together to use it for that Zoom class for the guild, and then finishing it and everything that happened in between that time. And so there's a lot of personal history in this. There's other very personal things that I can't share with you that are also a part of this quilt that that will go in the story of it, because I want these quilts, especially quilts that my family is going to divide up and keep for themselves, to have the stories of what was going on with me that I was working out while I was making this quilt, because it will um, give them just a deeper understanding of who I am, and the things that we don't realize that we don't know about people. And I think that's important. I think it's a real part of personal histories to be able to write about these things. And that's why I am giving a lecture and teaching a class about it, so that hopefully you can understand why that would be important. Um, Again, it's the significance of what was happening in the world, in our country. We've had, not only have we had COVID and all of the intricacies of um, navigating that, um, and just the political scene in our country, which I don't even want to begin to talk about. Uh, but then what's going on in my community, in my home, everything that's going on in my family. Hey, in August, I got a brand new granddaughter, a brand new granddaughter. Oh my gosh. See why it's important to write things down? Yeah, a brand new granddaughter. And her poor mommy was in the hospital, had her husband there, and none of the kids could go and see their new little sister. And I went the day my daughter was supposed to come home, and instead of her husband driving her home, I drove them home because I was the only visitor allowed that day. But there are such sweet things that have gone on during this period of time. It's been a time for families to draw closer together and spend quality time with each other as well as quantity time. And for, okay, so here's one thing, quilters. Who would have known that the quilters would save the world? With our quilting stashes, we were the ones who had all of that stash fabric and thread and the other stuff that we needed, probably elastic or stuff to make bias tape so that they could use ties to make masks for people. I mean, quilters have probably made 250,000 masks for hospitals and people and communities. And, 2020 was, it's been a hell of a year, but it was also the year that the quilters saved the world. And I love that. I mean, we put our stashes to really good use, and it's been really wonderful in that way. So anyway, that's basically my story. And I think maybe with the story, you can tell that that's just not a quilt. There's a whole lot of history in it, some really significant history for me and for the people who remain after I do. And so, anyway, if you have the time and if you're looking for a nice online class to take, you can find this class only at Road to California. And so if, let's see, it's www.roadtocalifornia.com. And it's one of the 4 classes that I'm going to be teaching. And so I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and the vidcast as well. So hopefully I'll have more to share with you in the really near future. And so until next time, happy quilting.